There was deep darkness in the sky. There was no visibility. After receiving the signal, two muffled shots were fired, causing two guards to fall. The shots continued for the next 15 minutes. As soon as everything fell silent, the radio echoed. The building is cleared and ready for evacuation. 14 years later, I found myself at the window of a hotel room, looking at the sunset, remembering how it all began, and thinking about how I ended up here sipping vodka. The liquid burned as I swallowed, flashing back memories of the past few weeks. Still, I held out hope that all was not lost. You see, 6 weeks ago, I stumbled upon the fact that my wife has been having an affair for the past 12 years. The discovery happened by accident. But isn't that how most clueless husbands find out? By the way, I'm Logan. Jamie and I met freshman year of college and dated until graduation. I joined the Marines and she started looking for a job. I loved her at the time, but I didn't want her to marry me while I was somewhere. It seemed unfair to her. So 5 years later, after my naval service ended, I came home and within weeks got a good job with a big company in their sales group. Turns out my boss is also a Marine and preferred to hire ex-military because of our disciplined work ethic. I have succeeded in my work by making a name for myself. During this period, I decided to re-enter the dating scene by exploring online sites. To my pleasant surprise, I found my college sweetheart Jamie at one of them. God, she looks good in these photos. Now, Jamie may not look like a supermodel, but she's got the body. In college, she studied modern dance, preferring to stay in shape. And what a shape she has. At 5 to 6 inches tall with dancer's legs, she is not overly muscular but curvaceous and boasts an amazing figure. Her long, flowing, rich brown hair frames her face, accompanied by those dark brown eyes and a smile that melts my heart every time I see it. She gives off a girl next door look that's sweet and innocent, with just enough cuteness thrown in for good measure. I registered as soon as possible and contacted her immediately. It wasn't until a week later that she responded asking where the hell I had been and why I hadn't called or emailed her in the last 5 years. If she was so upset with me for not contacting her during my naval service, she must have missed me. It was a very positive sign. We started dating soon after and basically picked up where we left off in college. A year later, we got married, and another year later, our first child, Rebecca, was born. My work was going well, even though I was traveling more, which was expected. 2 years later, our second daughter, Amy, was born. I have since been promoted, and now we live in a lovely house in a nice neighborhood with great schools. Although I still travel quite a bit, sometimes 2 weeks each month, it is a necessity for my job. It wasn't until a few years later that Jamie started asking when I would cut back on my travels. She missed my presence and felt safe when I was home. I explained that it was a necessary part of my job, assuring her that I would soon be taking it to the next level, greatly reducing my travel and allowing me to be home more often. She reluctantly agreed to it, but wasn't thrilled about me going on my next trip. In hindsight, I should have known there was trouble brewing, but I loved and trusted my wife so completely that I missed the first signs of trouble. The first clue was our arguments over little things. After my return home, she will blame me for things that have nothing to do with me. If you were at home more, this wouldn't have happened. Or we need you here instead of running around the country. She had a valid point, although it took me a while to realize it. The second clue came when I found some of her new underwear in the laundry room. While looking for a shirt, I came across silk underwear and a matching silk top. My wife usually has simple tastes, opting for a t-shirt and shorts or sweatpants before bed. The only time I bought her something from Victoria's Secret, she only wore it once and never again. However, the underwear I found was unfamiliar and I assumed she had bought it for herself. The third clue was a decrease in our bed activity. Our once passionate and romantic meetings dwindled. She offered various excuses. I was exhausted. It didn't seem like a problem at first, and I believed that things would get back to normal once my trips lessened. I refrained from pushing her, knowing that pressing the issue would make an already difficult situation worse. The final blow was devastating when I first opened it, and I hesitated to accept it. A mutual friend saw Jamie with someone at a farmer's market 40 miles from our house. At first thinking it was me, he watched as they held hands, laughed, touched, and kissed. Approaching, I realized that it was not me. Sensing something bad, he discreetly walked away, followed them for a while until they left in a car. I still remember that call. My cell phone buzzed as I was leaving the meeting. Frank called me and said he had something important to discuss. I told him I was between meetings and couldn't talk, offering to talk later. Frank agreed and asked me to call him as soon as possible with some concern in his voice. I assured him I would and asked if it was urgent, to which he said it could wait. I hung up the phone without hanging up on the call, figuring that Frank would have let me know if it was urgent. I called Frank back later that evening. I inquired about the reason for his call and what was important. Frank hesitated before telling me that he had seen my wife with another man earlier that day. Feeling nervous, I asked if she was with a friend. Frank tried to convey the difficult news, saying they were a couple, holding hands, laughing, and kissing. He apologized for breaking such news and suggested that my wife might be having an affair. These words hit me so hard that I was speechless. What made him think that? We were happily married and she had no reason to. I couldn't finish the thought. The clues I noticed earlier suddenly made sense, but I didn't believe it. Frank took me back, saying he knew it was hard, but I needed to know. He suggested that there might still be hope to save my marriage and offered his support, telling me to let him know if I needed anything. I confirmed and thanked him before hanging up, sitting on my bed and dealing with reality or a potential cruel joke. As I pondered, anger rose at the thought of my wife's cheating. On the flight home, I started to cool down and think more clearly about what needed to be done. Without hard evidence, I didn't know where to start. After landing, my first call was to Frank to get details about the man she was with. Protecting my daughters from our problems was very important. I wanted to save our marriage. Frank advised me not to do anything I would regret and told me he had a friend who had been through a similar situation. He suggested that I talk to him about how to handle the situation, stressing the importance of avoiding problems or making the situation worse. Frank's advice resonated, and I realized I needed some advice from someone who had been in a similar situation. Now, the best thing to do is go home and act like everything is normal. If she suspects you're up to something, it will be harder to gather evidence against her. I hope I'm wrong, but what I'm sure of is what I witnessed that day. Frank was right. When I got home, I managed to pull myself together to act normal around Jamie and the girls. It wasn't a walk in the park, but somehow I managed. In the days that followed, I scoured the house for evidence of her affair, but found nothing. Still, there was a nagging feeling that I might be missing something. Frank called and asked me to speak to a friend of his. I agreed to meet them at a bar across town the day after work, hiding it from Jamie by mentioning late meetings. At the dive bar, I found Frank and his friend Mark in the back booth drinking beer. Frank looked up as I sat down. Mark greeted me as Frank had mentioned. We exchanged greetings, though neither seemed thrilled to be there. Mark spoke after Frank had reviewed my situation. He sympathized with my feelings, but warned me against making the same mistakes he had by sharing his painful experience of revenge. This led to a 5-year prison term and losing everything in a divorce and lawsuit against his wife and her boss. He warned me against stupid things. His gaze is intense. I just nodded. Interested in alternative approaches, I wondered what he would have done differently. Mark admitted that he would have followed the boss, but more cunningly to catch him off guard. He expressed deep contempt for the man who stole his wife. As for his wife, knowing what he knows now, he would choose to divorce her. Our conversation then delved into the do's and don'ts of my situation. The first step was to obtain damning evidence of my wife's infidelity to prevent any denial when confronted. The second step was to consult a divorce lawyer to understand how to protect the property and determine my rights in this situation. The third is to keep a significant amount of cash in case she discovers my activities and freezes my accounts and credit cards. Finally, securing a small apartment or alternative accommodation was crucial in the event that I decided to leave, ensuring that I would have a place to stay. Although these suggestions were valid, I initially believed that I could resolve the issue through conversation. However, as soon as I mentioned it, Mark slammed his fist on the table. Mark stressed the importance of not being silly, noting that her new boyfriend may be filling her head with fairy tales. He suggested that before approaching my wife, I needed to understand what she had been told and what she believed. Mark drew parallels with my military experience as a Marine, emphasizing the importance of good information in combat. He emphasized the need for a plan of attack and strategy when things go sideways, stressing the importance of knowing which way forward. His question about my military service caught me off guard, and I confirmed that I was a Marine. I questioned the appropriateness, and Mark continued to stress the importance of having a plan and strategy, relating it to my current situation. I sighed, struggling to accept the possibility of my seemingly happy marriage coming to this. Mark apologized quietly, and we sat in silence until Frank broke it by asking about my plan and how I wanted to handle the situation. Realizing the need, I expressed my desire to save my marriage if possible. But most of all, I wanted another man to suffer without risking my own freedom. I made it clear that getting evidence and information about my opponent was a priority. Mark chuckled at my last comment. He advised against hiring a private investigator, citing his own expensive and unproductive experience. Having access to your bank, credit card bills, and phone records, he suggested checking for unusual purchases or calls. Also, exploring the possibility of a second cell phone and installing hidden video cameras throughout the house for visual and audio recording. Despite the discomfort, I agreed, determined to make him pay. Our conversation continued for another hour, during which I mentally noted the proposed proposals. Mark's advice emphasized the importance of not discussing the situation at work until I had identified my wife's potential lover, given the risk that someone familiar with my schedule might catch on. He also mentioned that he would be more subtle with his wife's lover, which made me determined to devise a plan to outwit the man. However, I needed more information and help. I agreed to meet them at a bar across town the day after work, hiding it from Jamie by mentioning late meetings. At the dive bar, I found Frank and his friend Mark in the back booth drinking beer. Frank looked up as I sat down. Mark greeted me as Frank had mentioned. We exchanged greetings, though neither seemed thrilled to be there. Mark spoke after Frank had reviewed my situation. He sympathized with my feelings, but warned me against making the same mistakes he had by sharing his painful experience of revenge. This led to a 5-year prison term and losing everything in a divorce and lawsuit against his wife and her boss. He warned me against stupid things. His gaze is intense. I just nodded. Interested in alternative approaches, I wondered what he would have done differently. Mark admitted that he would have followed the boss, but more cunningly to catch him off guard. He expressed deep contempt for the man who stole his wife. As for his wife, knowing what he knows now, he would choose to divorce her. Our conversation then delved into the do's and don'ts of my situation. The first step was to obtain damning evidence of my wife's infidelity to prevent any denial when confronted. The second step was to consult a divorce lawyer to understand how to protect the property and determine my rights in this situation. The third is to keep a significant amount of cash in case she discovers my activities and freezes my accounts and credit cards. Finally, securing a small apartment or alternative accommodation was crucial in the event that I decided to leave, ensuring that I would have a place to stay. Although these suggestions were valid, I initially believed that I could resolve the issue through conversation. However, as soon as I mentioned it, Mark slammed his fist on the table. Mark stressed the importance of not being silly, noting that her new boyfriend may be filling her head with fairy tales. He suggested that before approaching my wife, I needed to understand what she had been told and what she believed. Mark drew parallels with my military experience as a Marine, emphasizing the importance of good information in combat. He emphasized the need for a plan of attack and strategy when things go sideways, stressing the importance of knowing which way forward. His question about my military service caught me off guard, and I confirmed that I was a Marine. I questioned the appropriateness, and Mark continued to stress the importance of having a plan and strategy, relating it to my current situation. I sighed, struggling to accept the possibility of my seemingly happy marriage coming to this. Mark apologized quietly, and we sat in silence until Frank broke it by asking about my plan and how I wanted to handle the situation. Realizing the need, I expressed my desire to save my marriage if possible. But most of all, I wanted another man to suffer without risking my own freedom. I made it clear that getting evidence and information about my opponent was a priority. Mark chuckled at my last comment. He advised against hiring a private investigator, citing his own expensive and unproductive experience. Having access to your bank, credit card bills, and phone records, he suggested checking for unusual purchases or calls. Also, exploring the possibility of a second cell phone and installing hidden video cameras throughout the house for visual and audio recording. Despite the discomfort, I agreed, determined to make him pay. Our conversation continued for another hour, during which I mentally noted the proposed proposals. Mark's advice emphasized the importance of not discussing the situation at work until I had identified my wife's potential lover, given the risk that someone familiar with my schedule might catch on. He also mentioned that he would be more subtle with his wife's lover, which made me determined to devise a plan to outwit the man. However, I needed more information and help. The next business day, I scrutinized my upcoming travel plans for the next month, and discovered a 2-day trip. Concerned that someone at work knew my schedule, I had a low-key conversation with my boss, offering to extend my client visit by a full week. He approved the idea without hesitation. The next step was to create the illusion of departure and secret return. Using a prepaid debit card with cash, I purchased a return ticket on another airline. I bought a few spy cameras online and a regular camera with a powerful zoom that works well in low light. This was the first part of my plan to find out the man's identity. The second part was aimed at capturing them in the act on video, removing any doubt of her infidelity. My day was devoted to meticulous plotting and planning, a skill I excel at. However, an important piece of information that was missing was the identity of the person involved. Until that was resolved, I couldn't trust anyone, not even my best friend and boss, Hal. Knowing that it would take time to reveal this man's name, I remained determined. By the end of the week, all the items ordered had been delivered to Frank's home. Now I just needed the ability to discreetly install spy cameras around my house. With Jamie shopping with the girls and mother on Saturday, the house will be empty. A few hours later, all cameras were in place and tested. I could even follow them in real time from my tablet or laptop over the internet and watch what was happening. With the cameras installed, I began searching the house for evidence. First, I checked her credit card bills for any unusual expenses. Then I checked her closets to see if she had bought any new, more revealing, or nicer clothes. Although my search yielded no concrete evidence, I did come across a few more recent items, including a very short red dress that I had never seen her in before. The idea that she would wear it for anyone but me bothered me. Despite the lack of definitive proof, the red dress was a departure from her usual outfit, which got me thinking. I opted for a 5-mile run in my running shorts and shoes, a long run that usually calmed my mind and gave me clarity upon return. When I arrived home, spotting Jamie's car in the driveway, I knew my daughters, whom I affectionately called my angels, were home. Their voices and laughter as I walked in always brought a smile to my face. After calling Jamie, I was happily greeted by my girls who ran out of the family room to share their day. Jamie came out of the kitchen asking about my run and kissing me on the cheek before shooing the girls away. After cooking dinner, which consisted of pork chops, I enjoyed a shower and our dinner before putting our girls to bed. We watched TV in the family room. Although my preoccupation with the thought of Jamie's actions during my travels kept me from paying attention to the screen and feeling depressed, I called it an early bedtime and retired to our bedroom. In the bedroom, spotting Jamie's wallet on the trunk with hope, I took a chance and started looking for clues. To my dismay, I discovered a previously unknown cheap cell phone. Turning it on, I wrote down the number and looked through the call log, finding only one unknown number, which I also noted before turning off the phone. This new evidence made me finally accept the fact that she was having an affair. Heartbroken and consumed with a desire for revenge, I remembered Mark's advice not to act impulsively and decided to be patient. After quickly changing, I went to bed, pretending to be asleep when Jamie eventually joined me, avoiding conversation to prevent any inadvertent revelations. The next few days were difficult, trying to maintain a semblance of normality after the incriminating evidence was discovered. As the morning of another business trip approached, I went about my usual routine of packing my bags into the car. Just before leaving, I casually asked Jamie if she had anything special planned while I was gone, receiving a strange look when she mentioned the usual routine. Running through the possible explanations in my mind, I quickly said my goodbyes and drove to the airport, wondering if the cameras in our house would catch her with the suspect. Despite hoping for her decency to refrain from bringing him into our bed, I grew more and more convinced that she would never have betrayed me before all this. In the days that followed, having completed work with a particular client in record time, I packed up and prepared to return home. That evening, I reviewed the video from the cameras, but found nothing out of the ordinary. So I decided to go through the earlier entries. The system initiated recording when someone entered a camera-equipped room, storing all footage centrally, accessible remotely. As I fast-forwarded through that day's recordings, I discovered a moment where Jamie was talking on her secret cell phone. I stopped and reversed the video to watch her answer the phone calls, and then played it back at normal speed. The sound quality was poor, but I heard enough. She was talking to someone, calling them child. They discussed my absence for a week and the logistics of meeting inconspicuously at a motel. Despite my desire to hear the rest, she laughed and turned her back to the camera, making it impossible for me to catch the entire conversation. When she turned back, she continued, ordering the man to park on the street outside a coffee shop a few blocks away. "Okay, baby, I can't wait. See you tomorrow night." I couldn't believe what I had just heard. He was going to be in my house and in our bed. Thoughts of getting rid of his body crossed my mind, but Mark's warning echoed, telling me not to do anything rash. Holding back my anger, I decided to wait for the right moment, even though the tension was becoming unbearable. My wife, the love of my life and the mother of our 2 children, was cheating on me. Why did she do that? What brought her into the arms of another man? The flight home was too quick. I was not prepared for what awaited me. So I checked into a motel, pondering my next move. I knew he was coming to my house tonight, and I wanted to see him with my own eyes. Was it an acquaintance of mine or someone from work? That's all I needed to know to help me decide how to proceed. Not knowing what time he would arrive, I knew he was going to park at the cafe outside, so I waited there, even though I had no idea what he looked like. To be safe, I rented a car at the airport, finding a place with a good view of the parking lot. I picked up the camera, checking the quality of the zoom. I could be at least 100 yards away and see his face and license plate close up. Around 9 p.m., a silver BMW M3 pulled into the parking lot. I started taking pictures, and luckily the lighting was good, allowing me to see his face well. I didn't recognize anyone. He parked on the other side of the lot, away from the coffee shop, then walked to my house. I took a deep breath to control my anger as I sat there. I connected to the Wi-Fi from the coffee shop while viewing the cameras in my house. A few minutes later, I saw him come in and kiss my wife passionately. Controlling my rage, I listened to their conversation. He had been expressing his thoughts about her all day, and they discussed having the house to themselves until the next morning, as she had sent the children to her parents for the night and I wouldn't be back until Friday. How carefully she sent the children. I watched as he began to undress my wife right in our living room. She reciprocated, and in just a few minutes they were undressed, hands on top of each other. She offered to carry him to the bedroom, and they both ran out of sight of the camera towards the stairs. As I listened to their laughter as I left my clothes strewn on the floor, I knew I had to act. Fortunately for me, I got out of the car and quickly walked to my house. The front door was left unlocked as they hurried upstairs, making it easy for me. I headed straight for his pants, finding his wallet with all the information I needed and a little extra. With his wallet in hand, I headed to my home office on the first floor across from our bedroom, minimizing the risk of injury. After turning on the computer and printer scanner, I waited for them to turn on. When everything was ready, I began scanning the items in Stephen Bannister's wallet, copying his driver's license and other details. After returning the wallet, I took a picture of their scattered clothes and began to record what I observed with the video camera as I quietly climbed the stairs. As I climbed to the top, the faint sounds of their lovemaking reached me, turning my stomach. The bedroom door was wide open, and they thought the house was theirs alone. I slowly made my way to the bedroom. As their voices grew louder, I found myself in the doorway watching Steve on his back undressed and my wife on top in a classic 69 position, pleasuring each other. They were so engrossed that I managed to take a few steps into the room unnoticed. Knowing that hidden cameras do not provide the best definition, I wished for high-definition recording. I recorded for a few minutes before resisting the urge to grab a baseball bat and attack him. Mark's wise words echoed in my mind. Don't do stupid things. So I slowly backed away and left the house. Back at the hotel, my head was a mess, and the hatred I felt was at an all-time high. I couldn't remember being this mad, and it was starting to scare me. I called Frank and shared what I had done and the information I had received. Frank acknowledged my actions but expressed concern about the risk of being in the house again. He apologized for the situation and offered any help he could provide. I thanked him and told him that I needed to speak to someone and that I intended to ask Mark for a favor. Frank agreed to arrange a weekend meeting with Mark as Mark had expressed his willingness to help. After talking with Frank, I tried to fall asleep without success. I decided to clear my mind and get rid of my anger with my usual morning jog. However, this did little to soften my emotions. After my run, I showered and then took a long nap to deal with my lack of sleep last night. After returning my rental car to the airport, I picked up my car and headed straight to the office to check in and talk to Hal. I needed to cut back on work-related travel, and as I entered Hal's office, I closed the door, and informed him of my situation. I mentioned my wife's desire for me to be at home more and expressed the need to change my travel schedule. I looked at Hal, waiting for his answer. Hal informed me that my promotion had been approved and that I would no longer have to travel as often. It was a welcome relief, though I couldn't quite understand it at the time. My mind was consumed with the knowledge of my wife's affair. Hal noticed my distraction and expressed concern about my recent behavior. I felt compelled to tell him what I had discovered. I told him about catching my wife with her lover and recording them together. Hal reacted with shock and sympathy, offering his support. I explained that I needed to be home more to save my marriage and asked him to keep the situation confidential for fear that someone in the office might be involved in leaking information about my schedule. Hal agreed to cover for me if I needed time off to gather evidence against my wife. I expressed my desire to provide her with indisputable evidence to either save the marriage or defend myself in the event of a divorce. Hal nodded in agreement, promising his help and discretion. After thanking Hal, I left his office feeling a little relieved that everything was back to normal, even though I knew deep down that my marriage was beyond repair. I went home that night and did my best to act normal. My girls pounced on me when I walked through the door, and I couldn't help but cry thinking how the divorce would affect them. I didn't like the idea of having to get permission to visit my own children. I have to get custody of my children. On Saturday, while my wife and kids were out shopping, I met up with Mark and Frank at a diner. I updated them on the progress I had made in gathering information. Mark noted my boldness and expressed surprise that I had not taken more decisive action. He then asked how he could help me, mentioning that Frank had mentioned my time in prison. Both Frank and Mark looked at me curiously. For the next hour, I explained my plan and outlined what I hoped to achieve with Mark's connections. When I finished, Mark smiled and expressed his admiration for the plan. He mentioned that he knew someone who could potentially help me and suggested that they might be able to refer others, although he warned that they would probably expect payment. Mark agreed to make a few calls to his contacts. I gave him my mobile number and asked him to contact me after he talked to his friends so we could arrange a meeting and finalize the details. After discussing a few more ideas, I planned to implement them as soon as possible. I realized that I needed to do some additional shopping online to prepare for the next phase of my plan. The rest of the weekend went like most weekends, with one notable difference: Sunday evening. My wife and I usually make love on this night. This time she felt bad. It wasn't the first time, so it wasn't surprising. But more than a month has passed since the last time we were together. My next trip was coming up, and I asked Hal for the next week off. But when someone called the office, they were told I was on a regular business trip. He had no problem with it and wished me luck. So now I had to inform my wife that my next trip would be longer. She was not happy, but that was to be expected. I reassured my wife that my frequent trips would end soon and I would be home more often. Trying to cheer her up, I joked that I would be around so much that she would get sick of me. However, she did not respond with a smile. Instead, she sighed and told me to call her when I got to my destination. Her demeanor was distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage was coming to an end. I rushed out the door before saying something I regretted and headed back to the airport. The meetings with these clients went very well, and the deal was reached early, so I was able to fly in a day early. I kept checking the cameras for a week, but he never showed up at my house again. But I saw her on that secret cell phone of hers. So I listened to her talk and realized that this was the opportunity that the person was looking for, although I was very pleased to hear what she was planning to do. I went to the office and found the items I had ordered waiting for me. Knowing my wife's usual routine, I could easily set up one of these items I received with little chance of being caught. She went to the gym 4 times a week, and I knew where and when, so I had her spare car keys and was able to put the item where she wouldn't find it. I then went to Stephen's apartment to see if he was there. I saw his car parked in the shed, so I assumed he was home. I took the camera and checked to see if I could see him inside. I was very lucky when I saw him through the sliding doors and that he was not alone. He was with another woman, and they seemed to be romantically involved as they kissed and touched each other like a couple in love. It was too good to be true as I took a video of their affection for each other. When I saw them leaving together, I followed them at a safe distance. They went to lunch, and that gave me a chance to put another item on his car. It was a little more difficult and dangerous if someone saw me, but I was able to do it without getting caught. Now all I had to do was wait. It was the hardest for me. I got a call from Mark who said he had a friend who could help with my plan. We decided to meet in my hotel room to avoid being seen together in public given the nature of the activity we were planning. When they arrived, Mark introduced me to Joe, a computer hacker who could help with our scheme. For the next hour, I recounted the details of my wife's affair and expressed my desire to take revenge on her lover. I showed them the copies of the contents of the man's wallet that I had obtained. Joe expressed concern about the legality of our plan and demanded to know what it was for him. After some thought, I offered Joe $5,000 in cash. He agreed to the terms, but insisted on receiving half the payment up front and the rest after the work was completed. We discussed the need to gain access to the man's apartment to gain access to his computer and gather more evidence against my wife. With Steven's information, Joe used my laptop to review his recent purchases. What stood out were 2 plane tickets to Las Vegas and a hotel reservation for 5 nights. This marked our decision to break into his apartment, and Joe asked if he knew if there was an alarm system. I admitted my insecurities, so Joe agreed to investigate and contact me. When there was an alarm, he insisted on increasing the payment so that we could enter. I agreed to pay him more, depending on the rationale. It turned out that my wife was planning one last trip with this man. I checked my tablet to confirm the functionality of the tracking devices I placed in their cars, accessible via my tablet or smartphone to track their location. Also, I checked the home video cameras, confirming that she had packed a small carry-on bag for the trip. Day came and I followed their progress from my hotel room. I called Joe and he agreed to meet later in the afternoon. Although we found no visible warning systems, he stressed the need for caution. We met up a few blocks from Steven's apartment and discussed our itinerary. Joe, based on his prison experience, had a knack for picking locks. It was just after sunset, and the growing darkness helped keep one's sanity. With his laptop in his bag and my camera at the front door of Steven's apartment, Joe immediately dropped to his knees and worked on the locks for almost a minute. The door was soon opened and we entered, first checking for an alarm. After making sure they didn't exist, we proceeded to find Steven's computer. Fortunately, it was out in the open, allowing Joe to carry out his tasks. I interrupted him by saying wait while slowly videotaping the layout of the room. I want to make sure we leave everything as we found it. Joe nodded in agreement, acknowledging the importance of leaving no trace behind. He resumed his work while I looked for potential incriminating evidence. While going through his mail, including bank statements and credit card bills, I ventured into his bedroom while filming. The excellent cleanliness and high-end furnishings suggested wealth, leaving me still unsure of his profession. Joe's exclamation, "Damn it," brought me back to the living room. He successfully accessed Steven's online bill payments, revealing checks and additional credit cards. I was happy to take a card reader with me to record information from the magnetic stripe. Joe suggested making copies for online purchases, potentially maxing out your cards and hours. Joe smiled and asked if it was possible to clear the man's bank account. I confirmed it was possible by trying to make a transaction from a person's computer to make it look legitimate. Joe mentioned the possibility of a call from the bank to verify the transaction, but assured me that a password was not necessary since I had already copied the person's social security number from the wallet. I laughed at the man's carelessness and gave Joe the go-ahead to continue. Expressing my desire to inflict maximum damage on the man, I offered to immediately empty his bank account and sabotage his credit cards on the day he returned from Las Vegas. Joe enthusiastically agreed, calling it a fitting homecoming gift. He emphasized that it is important to cover one's tracks in order to avoid consequences. I assured him that I was taking precautions to avoid detection, pointing to the latex gloves we were wearing as evidence of our caution. I went back to search his bedroom and found nothing until I looked in his closet. I found a shoebox with several DVR discs. They were labeled with women's names. When I pulled out the box, I dropped it on his bed and started sorting through them. I didn't recognize any of the names until I saw Jamie's name. This idiot recorded the two of them together. But why? Joe called me into the other room to show me what he had found. He explained that the person we were targeting was involved in blackmail, possessing numerous videos of women with Steven. The women's faces are clearly visible in these videos, but Steven's face wasn't always visible because of the camera angles. Some of the emails showed that the women were being extorted for money with threats to use the videos against them in court. Joe believed that Steven preyed on married women with children, exploiting their vulnerability to his advantage. Seeking retribution, I asked Joe if Steven kept all the videos on his hard drive. Joe replied that he wasn't sure but suggested that the DVDs found in the closet might contain single copies. I decided to collect the DVDs and look for the backup disc, but I couldn't find it. When I got back to Joe, I learned that he had found the backup drive. After instructing Joe to make a full backup and wipe the laptop's drive, I explained our plan to bankrupt Stephen by destroying his blackmail scheme. I also expressed my desire to inform the women involved that they are no longer in danger. I asked Joe to print out all the relevant emails so I could set up an email account to contact them. He offered to create an account from Stephen's computer, and I agreed. After packing everything up, I took one last look around the place before we closed and quickly left. Back at the car, I handed Joe an envelope with the remainder of his payment, thanking him for his help. We shook hands, and he assured me that he would be ready to carry out the next phase of our plan if necessary. With these words, he left, and I returned to the hotel to continue the implementation of my scheme. I called my relatives to check on the children. My father-in-law answered, and I cheerfully greeted him, asking about the children and expressing my hope that they had not caused any trouble. He assured me the children were well behaved and mentioned Jamie's weekend trip with friends. I pretended not to know and said I hadn't spoken to her yet, stressing that I wanted to make sure the kids were settled before contacting her. After our conversation, it became clear that Jamie's father did not know about her affair in Las Vegas. This further cemented my disdain for her actions. My next call was to the house. I knew she wouldn't be there, so I left a message. Then I waited for an hour, and when she didn't call me back, I called her cell again. She didn't pick up, so I left a message saying I was worried that I called home and you didn't answer or call me back, and now you don't answer your cell phone. Please call me so I know you're okay. I also added that if I didn't hear from her within an hour, I was going to call her parents. 15 minutes later, I got a call from Jamie out of the blue. She asked if everything was okay, mentioning that she had tried to call home, but had not received an answer. I assured her that everything was fine, explaining that I had taken the girls to their parents after hanging out with friends. Jamie's response sounded somewhat strained. I suggested that we spend an evening together as soon as I got home in a week, but her response seemed uncertain. Feeling suspicious, I pressed Jamie, teasing her and trying to make her nervous. She stated that she was tired and hinted that she wanted to end the conversation. Respecting her wishes, I bid her a good night and expressed my love before ending the conversation. Despite my best efforts to remain calm, anger began to well up in me again. I didn't sleep well, so I got up early and went for a morning run. I went back to my hotel room and took a nice long shower. After that, I called the office to see if there was anything that needed my attention, but everything seemed to be going smoothly there. Then I got a call. All the parents are worried that Rebecca was injured at school and had to be taken to the hospital. At that moment, nothing was more important to me than my child's safety. The school first called my house. When no one answered, they tried to call me at work, which in turn was called by someone from my office. I called the school back, and they told me she had broken her arm and was in the emergency room. I rushed out the door and went straight to the hospital. Once there, I called Jamie's cell, and after getting her voicemail, yelled into the phone that if she didn't call me back in the next 15 minutes, I was going to make the next call to the divorce attorney. An hour later, my cell phone rang. I saw it was from Jamie. I declined the call and sat with my daughter while the doctor put a cast on her arm. She was crying, saying that she wanted her mother. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. It took a while, but she finally got the hang of it, and I took her to her grandparents. My phone rang again, and I declined again. When I calmed down, I called a good divorce attorney and made an appointment for the next day. Then Jamie called again. I took that call. She greeted me sarcastically, commenting on my supposed luck at the blackjack tables and informing me that she had contacted a divorce attorney. She tearfully threatened to use the video she had of me and Stephen as evidence to get full custody of our children. I reminded her of her absence when our baby was in the hospital crying for her mother while she was with her lover in Las Vegas. In an attempt to reassure her, I suggested that she might start a new life with Stephen and potentially have more children. She insisted that she loves and wants me. Feeling conflicted, I ended the conversation, unable to bear the emotional turmoil. I drove Rebecca and Amy home, helped them pack their bags of clothes, brought them to my hotel, and gave them their own room next to mine. Then I called Jamie's dad and told him what had happened at school and that we would not be living at home for the time being until some things were sorted out. My father-in-law called and asked about the situation between Jamie and me. I explained that we were having some problems, but suggested that he speak to Jamie for more details. He informed me that he would take care of the girls for the time being until he was sure of their well-being and safety. Although he didn't quite understand, he wished us the best and hoped we could work through our problems. I then contacted my attorney and instructed him to continue serving my wife. I then called Mark and ordered him to wreak havoc on Stephen by maxing out his credit cards, emptying his bank accounts, and damaging his credit. Later that night, Jamie called me in distress. At first, I was hesitant to respond after receiving a text message from her. She tearfully explained that Stephen blackmailed her by threatening to share the Vegas videos with others. I replied coldly, assuming that she had brought this on herself by getting involved in this affair. I hung up, knowing that Jamie needed to face the consequences of his actions. She decided to leave home and marriage for her own pleasure, and now she has to face the consequences. After deciding to end Jamie, I had to turn to her lover, Stephen. I called Mark and told him that I had contacted my lawyer to get Jamie to file the divorce papers, which would take a few days. Meanwhile, I wanted to transfer my money offshore, ensuring that only my funds would be protected. Mark questioned my decision, but I assured him that I was done with Jamie and decided to give her what she deserved. Mark mentioned the change of plans and suggested meeting at 5. We gathered at the dive bar and engaged in a long conversation that lasted almost 2 hours. Before we parted, we shook hands and I handed him a hefty envelope. For the next 3 days, Jamie kept calling and I kept ignoring him. I wanted her to suffer. Friday night, I got the phone call I was looking forward to. It was a video call. I answered on that end. There was a man tied to a chair and covered in blood. A voice in the background informed Stephen that his friend had a message for him. Stephen, staring at the screen, was approached by someone who mentioned his recent trip to Tijuana and the exhaustion that must come with it. The speaker alluded to Stephen's financial problems and suggested that his current situation would help him hide from the bank. The speaker continued by mentioning someone named Santiago and his special ragu, hinting at a sinister undertone. They explained that they could have sued Stephen for alienation of affection, but decided not to waste time. The message ended by saying goodbye to Stephen, revealing that someone named Mr. Lopez was now involved. I saw Stephen for the last time that day. I saw fear in his eyes. That's what I call a good investment. Stephen was still alive when he was lowered into a giant blue drum filled with Santiago's special mixture. No one heard from him again. No one even asked about him. After 7 months, I was a free man. I got custody of my daughters. I have to keep the house until both daughters are 19, and then we can sell and split the difference. There was no alimony or child support. I wanted nothing to do with Jamie, but she has visitation rights, and I usually leave my daughters with her and leave. A year later, I started dating Lisa. She used to be Amy's school teacher, and Amy seems to enjoy her company more than her mother. I haven't decided to get married yet, and I'm going slowly.